Well done, Father Peter. A very powerful presentation. Every word, I think, was glued to by everybody here, because we know you're very close to everything that you say. There's nothing conceptual about anything, so really powerful and well done, and thank you very much. And I know we'll have time in the Q&A for further dialogue. And you didn't even use Fiona's 2 minutes, so I'm just going to tell you. So Andy O'Hara next. Andy's been with us previously from Ishka, an advocacy group for people who use drugs, and he's going to, again, talk about some of the wider issues.
How you doing, folks? Listen, thanks, Paul, and there'll be some similarities between what I'm saying and Peter McFerry is saying, but I'll start out by saying I want to propose 3 broad themes for prevention that I think all the recommendations you make should be guided by, and they should be used to measure success going forward, that keep people alive, promote broader well-being, and improve quality of life. And we do that by decreasing generational trauma and promoting equitable well-being for everyone. In the 80s, we know heroin hit Dublin like a bomb, but heroin didn't actually create the problem, it just filled the void of poverty and trauma. Now, we know heroin made it worse, and we know some of the policies we developed also made it worse. Back then, we had high unemployment and poor quality of housing. Now we have high employment, but more and more people from all classes are actually struggling to survive, and there's massive issues with housing. So our issues are evolving, but are they improving is the question. And we now have more potent and a wider selection of drugs available, and they're in every city, town and parish in the country. We have an increase in drugs, an increase in people presenting with issues around drugs and mental health, and an increase in deaths and violence in our communities associated with drugs. Many of the areas that heroin originally hit in the 80s had regeneration projects, and there was a massive progress made. But if you talk to people in those communities, like I'm from myself, people will tell you that a lot of the issues have actually got worse. So they say that is because in some areas they got a physical regeneration, but not a social regeneration. Within that, there has been good work and progress, which we must promote and build on, but we also must look at what's not working to get the solutions. We're all aware of the scenes in Dublin at the minute in the media related to drugs and crime, and this usually hypes up a response that is based around fear and a lack of understanding of the issues, which then leads to actions that basically further stigmatise and further punish people, which usually ends up with just moving people and locking them up, when in fact that makes things worse. And we see that now, where people are moving out of the city centre into already further marginalised communities. And trust me, I know what shame and punishment does. As a person who used drugs for many years, the worse I was treated, the worse I felt, and the more drugs I took, which brought me close to death on many occasions. And what you're actually seeing in Dublin is examples of what happens when we have a lack of social policies, a criminalised approach, and a lack of community-led analysis that informs responses and interventions. And that is the same in rural and urban communities across the country. If we're going to talk about prevention, we need to look at why people use drugs. People use drugs to seek pleasure. And the people who are seeking the most pleasure are those that are struggling the most. So you have people who are trying to escape from their current reality, and then people who are taking drugs to in fact survive and stay alive because of the amount of trauma they've experienced. The first thing we need to do is prevent people who don't use drugs from using drugs. I don't want my kids to take drugs, and I also don't want them to have to see and experience the things that I had to. To do that, we have to address poverty and environmental factors of trauma. We have to create equal opportunities for people to be able to progress in life. What we need to do as a society is create the conditions for people not to need to take drugs, to cope with the everyday life, or in fact to survive. We then need to prevent people from moving from recreational drug use to drug dependence. 90% of people who take drugs do so recreationally. Now in our service, we are seeing more and more of this cohort who are veering towards drug dependence. And you know, if people can't get housing or a good standard of living or the type of life we all want, they struggle, and then they turn to drugs as a coping mechanism. We had an example of one chap that we're working with at the minute. 8 months ago, he was arrested for half a gram of coke. He went up in front of court. He was told it was a serious problem and he needed to do restorative justice. He would have had to go to that for 6 weeks and take time off work. He couldn't take time off work, so he got sacked so he could do it, so he wouldn't go to prison. He's now lost his job, lost his home, and he's living in homeless accommodation, and he's now taking drugs to cope with that, while his daughter, or his newborn baby, who's under the one, and his partner is back home living in their parents. Criminalising has not worked up until now. So let's not target and criminalise people who take drugs but do not have an issue with drugs. If they don't have an issue with drugs, don't bring them through the criminal justice system. And we want to prevent people from accessing the system. We're working with many, many women whose story is this: grow up in a disadvantaged area, experience trauma, commit crimes, take drugs to cope with the trauma, commit crimes, end up in front of court, get sent to prison for petty, petty crimes, come out of prison months later, they're homeless and their kids are in care. They take more drugs to cope with the trauma of that. Their kids who have gone into care sometimes take drugs, and then some of them go on to actually sell drugs on the streets of the city. So we can see that doesn't work for the parent, the child, or the community. And what we're doing there is we're making lifelong victims of the system, when they're the very people we need to be keeping out of the system. We know incarceration is an ineffective prevention model, and a review of compulsory treatment research found no improved outcomes from forcing treatment. Some studies actually found it harmful, and it impacts a person's ability to find employment, maintain family regulation, and navigate health systems. And the last thing we need to do is prevent people who are drug dependent from escalated harm. And we have to create services and responses that are built around the needs of people and trauma-informed, and the use of a human rights-based approach. That's not currently in place. We say it is, but it's not. And then to save people now, we need street-level drug check and intervention so we know what is in the drugs. Naloxone currently needs a prescription. That needs to be over-the-counter like in North America. Safer injecting facilities that were waiting six years need to be here now, but they need to be safe consumption rooms so that people who are smoking drugs across the city can access them. And we need to recognise that what these places do is they save lives, and they actually offer people pathways to recovery. And we need to take away the barriers for people accessing treatment. I previously said we don't want to force people into treatment who don't have a problem with drugs, but for large numbers of people who have issues with drugs, the waiting lists are far too long and the criteria is far too high. To do all this, what we need to do is implement the social determinants approach. The WHO says the environments we grow up in influence our outcomes. They state social determinants are non-medical factors that influence health outcomes, such as educational attainment, employment status, housing, whether you experience discrimination. And these are created, this is important, by social policies and norm, economic factors and political systems that shape the living conditions of people's lives. And we know the initiation of drug use can be driven by these very same environmental factors. And we see this play out in the prisons and the care systems all the time. We have a never-growing population of people going into prison and going into the care system. And 80 to 90% of them come from the very same communities that we're talking about. And I'm here to tell you from personal experience and from the experience of the majority of people we work with, most people who go to prison get worse, and they don't get the help they need. So if we're fooling ourselves into thinking people need to go to prison to get help, we're mistaken. Structural violence, substance use and trauma left unaddressed, that will lead to generational impacts. And what we usually do as a society then is we blame individuals for generational outcomes. We punish them, we re-traumatise them, and this leads to poorer outcomes and a breakdown in our communities. There's been a lot of talk about the 90% and the 10% of people who use drugs, and we're actually seeing more and more people who are employed and educated who have massive barriers to progressing in their lives. They're actually struggling with housing, the cost of living, childcare and access to medical care, and they are moving from recreational drug use to drug dependence. So we need to decrease generational trauma and promote equitable well-being through a social determinants approach, so we can actually prevent the never-ending cycle of people who are taking drugs to soothe the pain from environmental trauma or to actually just escape their current reality, and offer better opportunities to people who see selling drugs as an economic opportunity.
Just about a minute and a half, Andy.
Grant. And I'll just finish on this. We've heard the term, it's a wicked problem, and I just want you to encourage us not to think that this is too complex to solve. I'm here to tell you there are solutions, and we have them already. Issue submission, it's based on living experience of people, and it's backed up by research, and it provides evidence-based solutions. And it's proof of what happens when we have a ground-up approach that has the most impacted and with the most knowledge driving the change. It's why ISCA is actually so successful in what we do. We see people with living experience as our biggest asset, so they lead out on everything we do. That's actually a process that needs to be rolled out through a national independent framework. And that gives people a voice, it gives people a role, and it gives people a stake in our society, and that's how they become actors for change in their own lives and our communities. The research is being done, folks. The evidence has landed, and the recommendations are here, and they're ready for implementation. What we need is cross-departmental support to implement broader social policies. Remember this, policies create environments, Environments create trauma, and trauma leads to drug use and drug dependence. We need an increase in funding in the short term. Yes, projects like Ishka may struggle going into 2024, but we need to have an aspiration to have less services in 10, 15 or 20 years. Like our goal in Ishka is that there is no need for Ishka, that people are not stigmatised, discriminated and criminalised, where we see people with vital expertise as the solution and not a problem, where people who use drugs, families and our communities are leading out on a process that heals our communities and builds a more connected society. Let's end the moral crusade against people who use drugs. Create a system that supports people, not punishes them, and empowers us to build stronger communities together. I might just finish on this quote. A recent report by the UN Commissioner for Human Rights and the challenges of addressing the world drug problem urged policymakers to shift towards a health and human rights centred approach. I urge you to do the same. I'll leave you from a quote with that report. Shifting away from punitive models is critical to addressing all human rights challenges that arise from or are facilitated by the implementation of punitive drug control policies. Drug control policy should be understood as a way of achieving broader objectives, including the protection of human rights, in particular the right to health, ensuring equality and non-discrimination. For more information, read our submission. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy.